What would drive an entire family to erase themselves from history, not by accident, not by tragedy, but by belief? In the winter of 1840, a remote settlement became the site of one of the most disturbing family mysteries ever recorded. A search party entered the forests of Upper Canada and found a farmhouse that shouldn't have existed at all. What they discovered inside didn't fit any reportable category. 12 chairs, every plate set for dinner. Candles still burning, but no bodies, no tracks, not a single sign of life. Just walls were covered in black doorway symbols, drawn carefully, obsessively, until the entire house looked as if it was trying to erase itself from existence. What they saw there was classified so disturbing, the government buried every record of it for nearly a century. Welcome to Archives. Tonight, we're reopening one of Canada's darkest forgotten cases. The story of the Devlin Clan, a family who believed they could step beyond reality itself. But before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and what time is it over there right now? And if you're drawn to real stories like this one, stories that were never meant to be told, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Archives. Because what you're about to hear isn't folklore, it's documented. The Devlin case was a sealed fragment of Canadian history, locked away in an archive no one was meant to open. But when it resurfaced in 1991, the paper inside had already begun to dissolve. Names had bled through, the ink eaten by time. But the details that survived were enough to reveal something unthinkable. In the winter of 1840, 12 members of the Devlin family vanished from a settlement on the edge of Upper Canada's northern frontier. There had been no bodies, no witnesses, only a property too far inland for lawmen to reach before spring. By the time they arrived, the house stood empty, its walls marked with drawings and numbered inscriptions, a record of rules. The Crown classified the event as domestic disappearance due to famine and isolation. The file was closed, sealed by the Department of Lands and Settlements. But the Devlins had not starved. The evidence had not fit. Tools were still oiled, beds arranged, plates left clean on a long oak table. There was no sign of struggle. Everything appeared prepared, as if the family had simply stood up and walked out together into the trees. Yet the household records ended abruptly mid-sentence, frozen at a date that matched no existing calendar. For more than a century, the case lay buried in a government repository under the classification suppressed. Irregular anthropology. No one had requested it. No one had cited it. Only a faded line item in a ledger remained. Devlin Homestead. Revoked settlement. What persisted was silence. An administrative kind of forgetting, the kind that buries not only people, but the reason they ever existed. That silence held until a restoration team cataloging abandoned archives in Ottawa opened the wrong box. Inside were 33 documents bound with hempstring, property deeds, legal appeals, and one set of writings marked private. The handwriting was uneven, at times lucid, at times fragmented, like someone writing between fever and clarity. It was signed S. Devlin. The journal proved to be the only first-hand account of what had happened inside that house before the family vanished. Most pages were undated. Some were written in mirror script. Others had been entirely blacked out with ink, leaving impressions of words pressed into the fibers beneath. But between those erasures one could trace a pattern, not of a single night of violence, but of slow psychological disintegration, methodical and deliberate. When investigators began to piece together the fragments, a disturbing question emerged. Who had the authority to hide it? The records bore multiple signatures, magistrates, land surveyors, even clergy, all redacted. It appeared that the disappearance of the Devlins had not merely been tolerated, but protected. What remains today is not a mystery solved, but a window reopened by mistake. The Devlin file is less a case than a wound, sealed under layers of government dust. And through the surviving words of Sarah Devlin, brittle, half-erased, desperate to confess yet terrified to be read, the silence surrounding that family begins to speak again, one line at a time. Before the isolation, Cornelius Devlin had been a man of law, a magistrate in Upper Canada, educated in theology and jurisprudence, known for his meticulous reasoning and his disdain for sentiment. His downfall began quietly. An ethics inquiry, a sealed trial, a scandal that never made it to paper. The record ended with a single line: resigned due to mental instability. What followed was self-imposed exile, not madness, at least not at first. When Cornelius withdrew from public life, he carried with him a conviction that civilization itself was the lie, that morality was an invention designed to comfort the weak. He wrote of an authentic state, a condition stripped of pretense, where human beings could meet the truth of themselves without the masks imposed by law or conscience. Those who had known him later described this belief as philosophical, not violent. That distinction would vanish in time. The property he purchased was deliberate, miles from any settlement, dense forest on all sides, unreachable in winter. He arrived with his wife, Margaret, and 10 children, all under the age of 15. The house they built stood on a rise above the tree line, symmetrical and spare, a place designed more for observation than comfort. There he announced the beginning of what his journal later called the Great Work. At its core, the work was neither religion nor cult. It had been an experiment. Cornelius sought to remove from his family every trace of artificial morality, to reconstruct the human mind as it might exist unshaped by society. He believed that to understand truth, one had to dismantle everything that concealed it: compassion, fear, guilt, even love. He viewed these not as virtues, but as diseases of conditioning. Margaret's letters to her sister, recovered decades later, revealed how calmly it began. There were rules about speech, posture, and obedience, daily reflections on honesty and self-denial. Each evening, the family recited passages written by Cornelius himself, structured lessons, part philosophy, part confession. It had been austere, but not yet cruel. Even those who later condemned him admitted that his logic had been seductively clear, but logic in isolation always bent. The more perfectly he articulated his theory, the more impossible it became to live within it. He began redefining transgression not as sin, but as revelation. That breaking a rule could expose the illusion of the rule itself. Every violation became proof that morality had never existed. Slowly, the structure of family dissolved under the weight of principle. Father, mother, and child became roles without meaning, interchangeable, expendable. Cornelius called it purification through subtraction. To his followers, his family, it became the removal of everything unnecessary to being. He wrote, "To unmake what was made falsely is not destruction, but repair." What had begun as philosophy hardened into architecture. The house itself reflected his mind, bare, ordered, stripped of warmth. Every corner measured, every window placed with mathematical intent. It was not built to shelter, it was built to observe. By the time the first outsider passed through the region and described meeting a family without emotion, Cornelius Devlin had already achieved what he believed to be the first stage of authenticity. The process of unmaking had already begun, not with violence, but with reason. In the Devlin household, control had not arrived all at once. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with a single correction, a child's expression interpreted as betrayal. According to the recovered pages of Sarah Devlin's journal, the morning had been uneventful. Frost on the windows, oatmeal cooling in a shared bowl, silence at the table. The children had already learned that silence was expected, but then her brother Thomas smiled. No one ever determined why. Perhaps he had seen a bird outside the window, or perhaps it had been only habit, a reflex from a world that had still allowed warmth. Whatever the cause, Cornelius Devlin had stopped eating. He hadn't shouted or struck him. He had simply risen, placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder and led him into the cellar. The others remained at the table, motionless. That had been the first recorded instance of what would later be called the truth room. The rule that emerged from that morning would come to define the household: no public face. Cornelius declared that emotion was a form of deceit, a distortion of the true self. To smile, to frown, to weep, even to comfort another, was to wear a mask. The goal of the great work was to strip those masks away. Thomas's punishment had not been for disobedience, but for performance, for pretending to be human when the purpose was to transcend it. Sarah's notes described the hours that followed, not as chaos but as order tightening. The family ate in silence, finished chores, recited the morning passages. Only at dusk did Cornelius return from the cellar alone. He said nothing of what had occurred below, only that Thomas had been made clear. The phrase appeared repeatedly in later entries, often beside smudged or crossed-out lines, as though even writing it had carried danger. Days passed before Thomas returned. Sarah wrote that his skin was pale, his hair shorn unevenly, his eyes fixed not on anyone but on the wall behind them. He ate mechanically, spoke rarely, and never smiled again. The others understood without explanation that something irreversible had been established. From that point onward, the household operated by anticipation. Each child learned to suppress gestures, to erase tone, to watch themselves for traces of reaction. Punishment was no longer necessary. Fear had become self-enforcing. Margaret Devlin, once described as tender and composed, began correcting the children preemptively, smoothing the surface before Cornelius could notice the ripple. Records recovered later. Fragments of household notes and routine lists revealed how completely the new rule had integrated into daily life. Every entry began with the same words: faces clear, voices flat, hearts quiet. There were no variations, no deviations, as if individuality had already been removed from language itself. Investigators who examined the remnants of the property a century later found scratch marks along the walls of the cellar and iron bolts fitted into the floor. They confirmed the existence of a single narrow room, 10 feet long, windowless, acoustically perfect. There had been no evidence of violence, only containment. The truth room had not been built to punish. It had been built to refine. And from that first silent breakfast onward, emotion inside the Devlin home ceased to be human. It became a flaw to be corrected, a contagion to be cut out, until nothing remained but stillness mistaken for peace. From that point onward, the household operated by anticipation. Each child learned to suppress gestures, to erase tone, to watch themselves for traces of reaction. Punishment was no longer necessary. Fear had become self-enforcing. Margaret Devlin, once described as tender and composed, began correcting the children preemptively, smoothing the surface before Cornelius could notice the ripple. Records recovered later, fragments of household notes and routine lists, revealed how completely the new rule had integrated into daily life. Every entry began with the same words: faces clear, voices flat, hearts quiet. There were no variations, no deviations, as if individuality had already been removed from language itself. Investigators who examined the remnants of the property a century later found scratch marks along the walls of the cellar and iron bolts fitted into the floor. They confirmed the existence of a single narrow room, 10 feet long, windowless, acoustically perfect. There had been no evidence of violence, only containment. The truth room had not been built to punish. It had been built to refine. And from that first silent breakfast onward, emotion inside the Devlin home ceased to be human. It became a flaw to be corrected, a contagion to be cut out, until nothing remained but stillness mistaken for peace. In the months that followed the first punishment, structure became survival. The Devlin home no longer functioned as a household, but as a system, an enclosed order where every gesture, sound, and thought was governed by procedure. Cornelius had moved from rule-making to doctrine-building. His words were no longer instruction. They were law, and the family, stripped of all resistance, began to live as extensions of that law. It began with language. The journal fragments showed entire pages dedicated to new vocabulary, what Cornelius called the purified tongue. Everyday words were rewritten or eliminated. Words such as help, escape, love, and I were labeled contaminants. They were not forbidden because of what they meant, but because of what they implied: dependency, desire, and selfhood. To speak them was to admit weakness. The household replaced them with terms that removed agency. Help became completion. I was replaced by we. Over time, even these were reduced to silence. Language, once a tool of connection, became an architecture of control. When words vanished, thoughts followed. Sarah Devlin's later entries showed the erosion of pronouns entirely. She wrote in collective form, describing actions as though performed by a single entity. We woke. We washed. We served. There were no individuals, no voices, no boundaries. To lose the word I was to lose the idea that anyone could exist apart from the others. By the end of that winter, the Devlin home had operated like a clock with no hour hand. Each task repeated without awareness of time passing. Days blurred. There were no Sundays, no birthdays, no markers of difference. Cornelius had abolished the calendar. Time was replaced by rotation. A sequence of actions recurring endlessly, divorced from meaning. To live was not to progress but to repeat. The doctrine expanded. The children's chores became rituals, each assigned with exact precision. Beds aligned to face the same wall. Meals consumed in identical sequence. Even breathing was monitored. Margaret recorded intervals between inhalation and exhalation to ensure uniformity. The result was mechanical, almost liturgical. There was no conflict left to resolve, because conflict required individuality, and individuality had been erased at the level of grammar. From recovered household pages, investigators later confirmed that every evening had ended with recitations of clarities, a list of rules written in Cornelius's own hand. The entries were numbered but never explained. Rule 1, no public face. Rule 2, words must match silence. Rule 3, the self is the lie that must be unlearned. Each repetition of these rules deepened the family's dependency. To question had become unthinkable, because questioning required language, and language had been stripped of all oppositional structure. Even Sarah's writing, once emotional, confused, human, had turned technical, sterile, almost bureaucratic. It was the tone of a mind that had surrendered to order. By the time the journal's ink began to fade, the transformation was complete. The Devlin family no longer spoke to one another in any recognizable way. They had reduced language to sound, sound to rhythm, rhythm to silence. And within that silence, Cornelius had found what he called the beginning of truth. What had remained was not belief in a doctrine, but existence as doctrine. The Devlin home had become self-sustaining, a living system of obedience empty of thought, yet perfectly intact. The Devlin home no longer recognized the passing of time. The moment Cornelius ordered the clocks removed, chronology ceased to exist within its walls. What had begun as an exercise in discipline became the slow disintegration of perception itself. The family did not resist. They had already been trained to trust the absence of meaning more than its presence. Cornelius justified the removal as progress, an evolution beyond dependency. He claimed that time was the final illusion, a structure built to comfort the weak, to protect them from the weight of eternity. In his view, to measure life was to fear it. And so, the clock faces were dismantled, the pendulums stored away, and the rhythm of hours replaced with obedience to his voice. The journal entries after that point grew unstable. Sarah's handwriting slipped between lines, margins filled with unfinished words. Entries once marked by dates carried no reference at all. We woke, we slept, we woke again, one passage read, but it did not change. The family's sense of sequence had collapsed. Night and day were no longer opposites, only alternating states of light and dimness. Without time, tasks had no boundary. Chores continued until Cornelius declared them complete. Meals were eaten when commanded, not when hunger dictated. The human body, deprived of natural rhythm, began to fail quietly. Sleep deprivation set in. Margaret's final surviving letter described children who spoke while dreaming, who stood motionless in corners for hours, unable to remember what they were waiting for. Cornelius referred to these lapses as clarities. To him, exhaustion was not harm, but purification, a forced detachment from the illusion of sequence. He believed that when time dissolved, truth would surface. Under his control, disorientation became a form of worship. To lose track of one's place was proof of obedience. Sarah's surviving pages documented the toll with unnerving precision. She noted the sounds of movement when no one had been awake, the constant creak of footsteps that matched no living person's rhythm. Yet she never described them as hallucinations. Instead, she wrote as though observing natural phenomena. The double movements, as she called them, echoes of tasks repeated by memory itself. It was not madness in the ordinary sense, but the mind adapting to timelessness. By what could have been the third season, the household had fallen into perfect synchronization. Every motion mirrored another. No one spoke out of turn because there was no longer a concept of turn-taking. The passage of events had collapsed into endless repetition. Time, once external, now existed only inside Cornelius's commands. When investigators later reconstructed the site, they found no calendars, no candles worn down to mark nights, and no consistent pattern of wear on the furniture. It was as if years had passed without movement. The family's daily life had frozen into ritual. Cornelius Devlin's notes from this period consisted of a single phrase written repeatedly across the page. When sequence died, truth began. It had not been mysticism nor madness, but control, absolute and unbroken. The Devlins had surrendered the final dimension of human experience. In abandoning time, they no longer lived by its mercy, but what replaced it had been far colder. A life without beginning, without end, and without the smallest distinction between either. By the second year of isolation, Cornelius Devlin's doctrine no longer concerned behavior. It had advanced into something deeper, an experiment on the very concept of self. What he called the historical rotation was introduced not as punishment but as revelation. Each member of the family would, in turn, assume the life of one who had come before them. They would live through borrowed names, speak with inherited voices, and reenact events no longer their own. In theory, it was philosophical, a way to erase the illusion of individual continuity. In practice, it dissolved the family's remaining grip on reality. Sarah's journal marked the transition with precision. "Today I was Margaret," she wrote. The next entry began, "I had been Cornelius once." There were no explanations between, no signs of resistance. Only the steady acceptance of new identities, as though memory itself had been reassigned. Cornelius believed that the ego was a form of error. To eliminate it, he required the family to inhabit roles from their ancestry, names taken from forgotten relatives buried long before their birth. He read aloud from half-finished genealogies, assigning each child a lineage to embody. The effect had been immediate. Sarah began describing experiences of laboring in fields she had never seen, recognizing furniture that did not exist in their house. Her journal shifted tone from observation to confession. She remembered events that no living person could have witnessed. This merging of memory and fiction had not been delusion. It was design. Cornelius reinforced it through the environment. Rooms were rearranged without notice, walls moved, furniture exchanged between levels, portraits hung and rehung. Each alteration was recorded as correction. By destroying spatial constancy, he ensured that the family could no longer rely on memory as a compass. Every space became uncertain, every moment disconnected from the one before. The house itself began to behave like a living record, rewriting its own history each day. The phenomenon spread beyond the living. In one passage, Sarah wrote of hearing footsteps above her room that matched her own rhythm exactly, a duplication of motion that felt more like recognition than fear. She referred to the doubles, figures that moved as they did, but slightly behind, as though time itself had begun to echo. Investigators who studied her journal decades later described it as the internalization of lineage, a self-eroding beneath inherited consciousness. What made this stage of the Devlin experiment so disturbing was its precision. There had been no hysteria, no spectacle of possession. The transformation was administrative. Cornelius issued written rotations, signed and dated like a bureaucrat of identity. Each week brought another name, another life, another self overwritten. Within months, familial relationships collapsed entirely. Mother, son, and sibling were replaced by function, participants in a perpetual reenactment of ancestry. Sarah's later pages no longer belonged to any stable narrator. Pronouns shifted without warning. I became we became he, until authorship itself disappeared. She wrote, "It is difficult to know who writes now." The statement stood alone, the last line on an otherwise blank page. By then, even the house seemed complicit. Floorboards warped into unfamiliar patterns. Doors led to rooms that should not have existed. What had begun as a structure of obedience had turned into a shifting monument of identity undone. The historical rotation had achieved its goal. The Devlins were no longer individuals bound by lineage. They had become lineage itself, endlessly rotating through the memory of the dead. By the time Cornelius Devlin wrote the document titled The Eighth Permission, the transformation of the family was nearly complete. The earlier rules had already erased language, identity, and time. What remained to be dismantled was morality itself. Cornelius described the new decree not as liberation, but as culmination, the point at which the great work no longer required justification. The Eighth Permission stated simply, no act is forbidden that brings the work nearer to its end. It marked the final erasure of restraint, the declaration that there could be no sin when every action served truth. Cornelius had come to believe morality to be the last illusion, the structure by which humanity chained itself to guilt. To transcend, one had to destroy the very idea of right and wrong. In the surviving notes, his reasoning appeared chillingly precise. He wrote that morality was a boundary drawn by the frightened, and that to fear consequence was to remain human. Within this framework, violence ceased to be crime, it became method. Pain, hunger, and deprivation were not punishments, but instruments of revelation. Cornelius had turned suffering into philosophy. The truth room, once a place of correction, evolved into its opposite. It became the threshold through which members passed willingly, seeking clarity through endurance. To be confined, there was no longer shame, it was privilege. Those who emerged changed were considered purified, closer to completion. Those who did not return were recorded as fully clear. Sarah's remaining entries described this stage in language stripped of emotion. She wrote, "We understood now. The body obeyed. The work advanced." There was no sense of horror, no plea for help, only an administrative precision, as though she were documenting factory procedure. It was in that mechanical tone that the true depth of collapse revealed itself. They had not been victims struggling against belief. They had become the belief itself. Margaret Devlin, whose earlier writings had contained traces of doubt, appeared only once more in this section. Cornelius recorded her as willing for clarity. No record indicated her outcome, but the shift in tone suggested that opposition was no longer possible. To resist the work was to acknowledge the self, and the self had already been abolished. Investigators later uncovered a collection of carved wooden tablets hidden beneath the house, each inscribed with variations of the Eighth Permission. Some were incomplete, others mirrored backward, as though rewritten compulsively. It suggested that the doctrine had spread beyond Cornelius's control, repeated and interpreted by the others without his command. The belief had taken on a life of its own. What distinguished the Devlins from any cult or communal delusion was the absolute absence of chaos. The final descent had been orderly, every action documented, every disappearance noted with calm finality. There had been no frenzy, no spectacle, only quiet execution of principle. The Eighth Permission had not destroyed the family, it had completed them. In their silence, Cornelius saw perfection. In their obedience, he saw proof that morality had always been the lie. And somewhere beneath that frozen structure, among the bones of their own convictions, the last trace of humanity had vanished, willingly and without remorse. The first recorded breach of reality within the Devlin home occurred without warning. It was not described as an event, but as a correction, an alignment. The surviving fragments from Sarah Devlin's journal offered only glimpses. Phrases half-finished, margins soaked through by damp, sequences of numbers written over and over. From these fragments, investigators later reconstructed what they came to call the first crossing. The ritual itself had been simple, at least in form. Cornelius gathered the family in the main room after what Sarah referred to as the long night, a period with no measurable beginning or end. The entry began. We stood facing the north wall. Father spoke of convergence. We listened until there was no sound left to hear. There were references to drawings, geometric markings etched into the plaster, layered atop one another until no clear pattern remained. Sarah noted that light had not behaved normally that day. It hadn't flickered or dimmed, but seemed to bend around the walls, as if the air itself had grown heavy. Whether this had been exhaustion, deprivation, or something else entirely, no one could confirm. Cornelius instructed each family member to step forward and place a hand on the wall. He told them it was time to see what separates and what connects. The wording appeared again in his surviving notes, suggesting it had not been metaphor but procedure. The journals indicated chanting, though no words were written, only a pattern of dashes and intervals. The atmosphere, as described by Sarah, had been one of submission, not ecstasy. This had not been worship. It had been compliance taken to its final form. Then came the blank section, pages missing, torn cleanly from the spine. The next entry resumed mid-sentence. Elizabeth was gone. There was no description of how, only the aftermath. Sarah wrote that the wall appeared thinner where Elizabeth had stood, that the texture had felt wrong beneath her palm. Neither cold nor warm, neither surface nor air. The others stood motionless, waiting for instruction. Cornelius declared the act a success. He wrote in his own ledger, "One has passed through, one has become whole." His tone, even in handwriting, was measured, not celebratory but analytical. Elizabeth's absence was treated as evidence of progress, not tragedy. There was no mention of grief, no question of retrieval. Instead, Sarah's later notes described an unsettling development, the gradual erosion of memory itself. Within days, references to Elizabeth vanished from the journal entirely. Her name was scratched out from earlier entries, her possessions redistributed. Even Sarah wrote there had been another once, but her face did not remain. The erasure appeared systematic, not accidental. It was as if the family had absorbed her disappearance into the doctrine, a demonstration that the boundary between existence and non-existence could be crossed and then forgotten. When researchers later examined the remaining pages, chemical testing revealed traces of an unknown residue along the edges. Not ink, not mold, but a substance that refracted light differently under ultraviolet exposure. The same residue was later found beneath fragments of plaster recovered from the Devlin property. No bodies were ever discovered, no graves. Only one consistent statement repeated across every surviving source. Elizabeth had been successful. What she became or where she went remained unrecorded. But from that moment onward, the Devlin family no longer feared disappearance. They began to seek it. In the months that followed Elizabeth's disappearance, the Devlin household entered what investigators later referred to as the degenerative phase, the point at which the distinction between body and environment began to collapse. Nothing in the journals indicated panic or recognition of illness. The changes were catalogued with the same bureaucratic precision as every other stage of the work. Disintegration was treated not as crisis, but as progress. Thomas Devlin appeared to have been the first to exhibit visible decline. He had stopped eating entirely, insisting that nourishment was no longer required. Margaret recorded his refusal without protest. She noted that his pulse remained steady for weeks, despite the absence of food, his body weight decreasing, but his movements unimpaired. He claimed to hear vibrations within the walls, not voices, but a rhythmic resonance, as if the structure itself were breathing. Cornelius interpreted this as alignment with the underlying pattern. The others soon followed. Hunger was dismissed as weakness, fatigue as misperception. The family's skin grew translucent, thin enough that veins beneath the surface appeared like drawn maps. Sarah's journal described the sensation of air pressing against her bones, a physical awareness of her own interior. Her entries became shorter, faint and erratic, often breaking mid-sentence. She referred to herself not in the singular but in plural. We felt, we saw, we receded. Margaret's transformation differed from the rest. In one entry, Cornelius praised her for achieving what he called voluntary emptiness. She had ceased speaking altogether, communicating only through movement. For days at a time, she reportedly remained motionless in doorways, staring at fixed points as though her perception had detached from the present. Her body became an emblem of stillness, the form Cornelius described as beyond impulse. The surviving pages from this period read more like laboratory notes than diary entries. Sarah documented shifts in her awareness of location, claiming to wake in rooms she did not remember entering, sometimes observing herself across the space. She described temporal bleeding, moments repeating, overlapping, converging. The days have collapsed into each other, she wrote. The house remembers us in pieces. When the property was excavated over a century later, investigators found structural irregularities consistent with her descriptions. Walls appeared to have been rebuilt repeatedly within the same foundation, layers of material folded over one another like sediment. It suggested a physical manifestation of the family's internal collapse, an architecture constantly rewriting itself. Medical examiners who studied household artifacts noted further anomalies. Utensils and textiles bore fingerprints from multiple individuals compressed into single impressions, as though used simultaneously by several hands. The Devlins had succeeded in dissolving individuality, but at a biological cost. Their forms no longer held boundaries. Flesh had thinned to transparency. Thought no longer belonged to a single mind. The process had not been instantaneous. It had unfolded slowly, methodically, under Cornelius's supervision. By the final pages of her journal, Sarah no longer described events, only sensations. "We were light through thin skin," she wrote. "We were becoming the space between." It had not been death that overtook them, but diffusion. The Devlins had not vanished. They had simply become too thin to be seen. The next phase of the work began not with revelation, but with handwriting. Among the surviving materials recovered from the Devlin property were 2 journals attributed to Sarah. The first had been written in her known hand, fragile, deliberate, but legible. The second was not. Its script appeared erratic, looping and composed of symbols that matched no known alphabet. Linguists who examined it later referred to it as the underneath language. The entries in this second journal seemed to have been written without conscious intent. Pressure marks on the paper indicated continuous writing for hours at a time, without pause. In several passages her handwriting overlapped, lines crossing at impossible angles. Laboratory analysis confirmed that the ink composition had remained uniform, evidence that these markings were produced in a single sitting. What Sarah described prior to this shift proved significant. She began hearing patterns within silence, repetitions that she compared to breathing. The sounds appeared to arrange themselves into rhythms that compelled transcription. She wrote, "There is speech in what is not said. It arranges itself through us." What had begun as involuntary notation evolved into a system. Over time, she recognized that what she wrote began to alter what she perceived. The phenomenon manifested subtly at first. Objects appeared misplaced. Shadows shifted against light. The family noticed distortions in glass surfaces, reflections that failed to match the room behind them. Sarah recorded black water collecting beneath the floorboards, thick, reflective, leaving no residue. Cornelius interpreted these manifestations as proof that the boundary between word and matter had collapsed. He concluded that the written form itself carried generative power. To write within the underneath language was to participate in creation. Every mark was an instruction to reality. From that point forward, he forbade speech within the house, except for written expression, claiming that spoken words lacked precision. Pages were nailed to walls, ceilings, and doors until the house was covered in symbols. Each day brought new configurations, each altering the environment imperceptibly. Investigators later confirmed that fragments of these markings remained etched into plaster layers beneath the paint, neither fully inscribed nor erased. Under ultraviolet analysis, the patterns emitted a faint phosphorescence, though no chemical explanation was found. Sarah's later entries depicted the language as consuming. She began writing while asleep, waking to pages filled in an unfamiliar hand. At times, entire sections mirrored themselves across the page as if written simultaneously from both directions. Her attempts to translate her own work led to physical distress, nosebleeds, dizziness, temporary paralysis of the right hand. She wrote that her body was becoming an instrument, that her pulse matched the rhythm of the writing. The family's shared perception fractured completely. They no longer differentiated between what was imagined and what was material. They wrote to define objects, to correct distortions, to erase what should not exist. Each mark made the world less stable, more responsive. By the final pages, Sarah's voice had nearly vanished. The text evolved into pattern and pulse. The last decipherable line read, "The word remembered before the world did." It was at this point that the great work reached its most dangerous stage. The moment when thought no longer described reality, but replaced it. From then on, language itself had been the infection the Devlins could neither contain nor survive. The final coordinated experiment within the Devlin household took place sometime in late 1841, though no precise date was ever determined. What remained were partial accounts from Sarah's fragmented writings, several cryptic annotations by Cornelius, and the floorboard carvings found decades later. Collectively, they described an event the surviving documents referred to only as the trial crossing. The family had rehearsed the procedure for months. The ritual drew from the patterns previously written in the underneath language, intersecting shapes, repeating sequences of syllables whose meanings had long since detached from speech. Cornelius arranged the household into concentric circles drawn on the floor in charcoal and soot. The family stood barefoot, hands interlinked, facing inward. Each bore a mark on the wrist, a spiral crossing into itself. The experiment's purpose, according to Cornelius's surviving notes, had not been to summon or reach beyond, but to merge. He theorized that through collective alignment, the Devlins could remove the barrier separating perception from existence, not an act of faith, but of geometry. The drawings recovered from the property supported this interpretation. Spirals, tessellations, and mirrored floor plans, all nested within one another, as though the house had been preparing to fold inward. Sarah's entries leading up to that night described increasing disorientation. She wrote that the structure of the home had become inconsistent, hallways expanding or contracting between steps, doorways leading to unfamiliar copies of rooms she had already left. She recorded seeing herself in these spaces, not reflections, but independent iterations moving fractionally out of sync. "They know the order better than I do," she wrote, "because they are already where I will be." The trial crossing began at dusk. Candles were extinguished. Light, Cornelius claimed, was unnecessary, as the inner illumination would guide them. The family initiated the chant, a rhythmic sequence of consonants and inhalations resembling controlled hyperventilation. Over the following hours, Sarah's handwriting broke apart into fragments, walls no longer opposite each other. Heartbeat repeating outside the chest. We were passing through our own outlines. After that point, the record fractured. 1 page later, she wrote, "There were more of us than there had been before." Another followed. The house continued in all directions. Investigators later interpreted these as evidence of mass dissociation, a psychological state induced by sensory deprivation and group suggestion. Yet several physical anomalies remained unexplained. The foundations beneath the house were found to contain impressions resembling human footprints embedded in solid stone, as if the material had softened momentarily under pressure. The final legible entry in Sarah's journal read, "We have met the ones who were already us." The handwriting differed, smaller, steadier, as though written by another hand entirely. There was no continuation beyond that line. When authorities eventually searched the property, no trace of the family was found. Food remained uneaten, candles unlit, furniture undisturbed. Only the drawings on the floor had changed, fused into a single continuous design that could not be replicated without crossing its own lines. The trial crossing marked the Devlins' final recorded act. Whether it had been collective delusion or an engineered passage into something unmeasured remained uncertain. What was known was this. From that night onward, the Devlin name disappeared from every provincial record. In a literal sense, they had succeeded. They had stepped beyond the margins of history itself. The last confirmed movement of any Devlin was Sarah's escape. Her departure had not been impulsive, nor born of panic. It had been the deliberate act of a mind surfacing briefly from collapse. After months of collective dissolution, she appeared to have experienced what she later called clarity, a moment in which the house's endless rhythm faltered long enough for memory to return. Her surviving pages suggested that she had planned the escape in fragments. Small entries were hidden between layers of the underneath language, sentences written backward, visible only under angled light. "If they read this," she wrote, "they will think it is part of the work." That concealment had allowed her to plan unnoticed, embedding rebellion inside obedience. By that stage, the family lived under constant observation. The others no longer slept. They recorded each movement, each breath. Cornelius had announced the final crossing, a collective ritual meant to erase the last boundary between self and pattern. Sarah appeared to understand that once it began, it would end in disappearance. She resolved to leave before the final act commenced. On the night of her escape, the family gathered in the central room. She referred to it as a council, though no one spoke. Cornelius wrote instructions on the floor with ash, his handwriting unbroken. Sarah positioned herself near the outer wall, marking the rhythm of their breathing. When the chant began, measured, controlled, she stepped backward into the hallway. No one turned. The rhythm continued without her, as though her absence had already been accounted for. Her exit had been slow, calculated, almost ritualistic. She moved through the structure carefully, navigating rooms that no longer aligned. The house seemed aware of her departure. Doors jammed, floorboards shifted, shadows lingered longer than light allowed. She described the sensation of walking through a place remembering itself incorrectly. Outside, the air felt disjointed. Unmade, she wrote, as if it did not belong to the same season. The forest offered no direction. Every path mirrored another. For days she wandered, eating bark, drinking from thawing streams. She began to hear the family's cadence within the wind, a slow, pulsing breath that never quite stopped. Hunger gave way to fever and fever to exhaustion. Weeks later, she reached the edge of civilization, a logging camp south of the Ottawa River. Witnesses described her arrival as a figure emerging from weather, barefoot, emaciated, unable to speak above a whisper. The physician's report listed severe malnutrition, dermal lesions resembling ink burns, and circular scars along her wrists, consistent with restraint. She provided no surname and claimed only that she had come from the house beyond the clearing. The only coherent statement she offered was this: they had gone through. I stayed behind. Her words were interpreted as the remnants of delusion, but her physical state suggested something deeper. A body surviving separation from something it had once been part of. She lived for several weeks after her recovery. During that time, she filled one final notebook with indecipherable markings, repeating a single pattern along the margins, a doorway intersecting itself. The same design would later be found carved into the Devlin house's foundation. Sarah Devlin had escaped the property, but not the work. She had crossed back into the world, carrying its residue, its language, its geometry, its unfinished purpose. And even in her brief return to reason, she appeared to understand that what she had left behind had not remained there at all. When Sarah Devlin was found dead in the infirmary of the Bytown Mission Hospital, the attending physician documented her case with professional restraint that failed to conceal its unease. The file was brief. 7 pages, typed and stamped unexplained anomalies, retained for study. She was listed as 27 years old, though the condition of her body made that uncertain. The language of the report was clinical, yet even within its precision, a sense of dread persisted. Her remains displayed changes inconsistent with starvation or exposure. Bone density measurements indicated a degree of hollowness similar to avian structures, light, porous yet unbroken. Autopsy notes mentioned a faint electrical odor, a trace of ozone that lingered even after the body had cooled. Her skin showed no decomposition, but carried microscopic metallic particles embedded beneath the surface, as if dusted with graphite. None of these findings correlated with any known pathology. The absence of decay disturbed the examiner most. The body resisted both rigor and softening, suspended in a state between preservation and deterioration. Samples were sent to Ottawa for analysis, but the results were never disclosed. The accompanying memorandum from the Department of Lands and Settlements contained only one instruction: cease further testing. Beside the bed, nurses discovered a small leather notebook bound with twine. It became known as the final journal. Unlike her earlier writings, this one alternated between legible English and symbols matching those of the underneath language. The handwriting appeared unstable, alternating between trembling script and mechanical precision, as if produced by alternating states of consciousness. The first pages remained lucid. She wrote of her dreams. They were here, but not as we were. They moved through the same rooms, but without weight. Later entries fragmented into detached statements. The air remembers us. The ones who are no longer people. The house exists twice, and both are correct, though disconnected. The repetition of these ideas implied an awareness that the Devlin property, and whatever it had opened, remained active. Her final entry, written hours before death, was concise but deliberate. The crossing was not theirs alone. It continues through what is seen and what is spoken. The walls will not hold it. Beneath this, 3 faint symbols repeated across the page. The intersecting doorway motif, identical to the carvings found beneath the original Devlin house. After her death, staff reported that the odor of ozone filled the infirmary wing, briefly triggering the galvanic instruments used for static discharge testing. No mechanical cause was identified. Within a week, the notebook and autopsy files were requisitioned by the Department of Lands and Settlements, the same body that had sealed the Devlin file a century earlier. None of the materials were ever returned. The coroner's report ended with a final observation. Patient expired at 4:17 a.m. No muscular tremor. No vocalization, eyes open, fixed forward. Beneath the typewritten line, a marginal note in the examiner's handwriting read, "It appeared she was watching something behind me." Sarah Devlin's final warning survived only through a paraphrased note in an unsigned memorandum. The work was not concluded. The door remains where it was built, on both sides. The official return to the Devlin property took place in October of 1842, nearly a year after the family's last trace. The operation had not been driven by curiosity but by administrative obligation. A newly appointed magistrate, Jonathan Crawford, had been tasked with reclaiming abandoned land titles for the Crown. The expedition's purpose was procedural, to confirm the settlement's abandonment, catalogue any assets, and report its condition. What Crawford and his men found never appeared in public record. The first surviving account of their arrival was preserved in Crawford's private ledger. He recorded that the path to the Devlin homestead had vanished beneath new growth. An entire forest reclaiming ground within a single season. When they reached the clearing, the house stood intact. The windows were unbroken, the structure untouched by weather or decay. It appeared preserved in suspension, immune to the passage of time. Upon entering, they noted an absence of disturbance. Dust was minimal, yet nothing seemed recently used. Dishes were arranged neatly on a long table. 11 beds had been made. There should have been 12. Clothing lay folded by size, books ordered by height. There were no signs of struggle, no trace of rot, only an overwhelming stillness. Crawford wrote that the walls were alive with markings. Every surface bore inscriptions, carved, painted, or scratched into the wood. The recurring motif of interlocking doorways dominated the design, layered until the lines became solid black panels. In certain rooms, the markings reflected faintly, as if varnished from within. The expedition's physician, Dr. Amos Field, reported an acoustic anomaly. Spoken words echoed with a measurable delay, repeating fractions of a second after they were spoken. He noted that the echo altered in tone, as if the sound had passed through another medium before returning. Within 2 hours, one of the assistants, identified only as MR, suffered acute disorientation and panic, claiming that the house's layout had changed between entries. He was removed and later diagnosed with hysteria. The cellar was examined last. Crawford descended with 2 men and a lantern into what local rumors had called the truth room. The chamber measured 10 feet long, lined with smooth stone. On the floor were iron fittings, thin chains, and etched circles filled with incomprehensible text. Field reported that the air was colder than above ground, though no draft existed. He refused to elaborate on what occurred next. Crawford's handwriting deteriorated in the following pages. He mentioned hearing movement behind the walls, a sound like breathing, followed by the sense that someone stood directly behind him in the confined space. The report ended mid-sentence. Days later, the expedition withdrew from the site without formal conclusion. Official correspondence recorded the land as quarantined due to instability. No further surveys were authorized. Within months, the Devlin homestead was removed from all regional maps. Its coordinates were sealed under the Dominion Archives Act of 1843. The materials were placed under restricted classification, anomalous settlement, Upper Canada. Crawford was institutionalized shortly after. His final written statement, recovered years later, contained a single sentence. There had been 11 beds, but 12 dreams. The file was closed. The forest reclaimed the clearing, and the silence that followed became the last act of the Devlin family's disappearance. Not through death, but through deliberate forgetting. Time should have erased the Devlin story. It should have collapsed into rumor and soil, like the forest that had swallowed their home. Yet the record did not remain closed. Over the next century, fragments reappeared. Not through deliberate research, but through accidents, misfilings, and the kind of coincidences that suggested something beneath history had continued to move. The first documented reoccurrence took place in 1934. A group of university surveyors from Kingston, assigned to rechart forgotten land boundaries, reported encountering a house that appeared on no existing map. Their photographs, later recovered from a departmental archive, showed a timber structure matching the dimensions of the Devlin homestead. Intact, windows sealed from the inside. The men claimed to have heard low vibrations from within, like air drawn through wood. When they returned the next morning, the structure was gone. The photographic plates, however, preserved faint silhouettes, human figures, still and indistinct, standing behind the glass. None of the surveyors could later agree on how many there had been. The second incident occurred in 2003. A documentary crew researching lost pioneer settlements in the Ottawa wilderness recorded severe interference while filming in a remote clearing. GPS signals failed, batteries drained. The audio captured a rhythmic pulse of 5 beats repeating at equal intervals. During post-production, a sound engineer noticed that the waveform resembled overlapping doorframes. The footage was never released. Insurance documentation filed after the incident listed the loss under irretrievable magnetic distortion. The third case emerged in 2019. A hiker from Quebec uploaded a sequence of photographs to a public forum, claiming to have discovered an abandoned house north of Pembroke. Within hours, the images were removed, but archived copies persisted. In the final frame, taken through a shattered window, 11 identical chairs surrounded a long table. On the far wall, faint beneath layers of paint, appeared the same interlocking doorway design found in the 1842 expedition sketches. 2 weeks later, the hiker's disappearance was reported. His vehicle was found abandoned on an unmarked road near the same coordinates once listed in the Devlin file. Analysts who later examined these materials identified consistent irregularities. Blurred edges where static objects should have remained fixed, temperature readings inconsistent with environmental data, and identical electromagnetic signatures recurring across decades. Each record contained marginal handwriting, always in the same faint hand, always the same 3 words: "The work continues." Contemporary researchers studying the Devlin file no longer classified it as a case, but as a contagion of information, a pattern that replicated itself through written and spoken language. Each retelling appeared to generate new anomalies. Transcriptions diverging from originals, photographs altering upon reprinting, testimonies contradicting the witnesses who gave them. The data suggested that the act of describing the Devlins had become inseparable from the phenomenon itself. This was how the work endured, not as haunting but as recursion. It no longer required participants. It propagated through record, through memory, through the human impulse to understand. The doorway they built had not been physical, nor had it ever been meant to close. Every repetition of their story became another opening, every listener another witness. The Devlin history did not end. It adapted, and those who had read this far had already entered its continuation. The coordinates of the property remain redacted. The house has not been found again. Yet the story persists, each part of it retelling another dark part of that house. If you're still here, subscribe to X Archives and like this video, because somewhere the work continues, and silence is how it spreads.